Are Americans obsessed with race? It's not really our fault. It was built into the system from day one. For decades, the government is obsessed with precision. They are out there with a freaking microscope. They got you under a microscope. They need to know, are you an 8th black? Are you a 16th? They're making blackness into mathematics, right? I want you to read the actual language from the 1930s Census enumerator instructions. I think these are incredible primary sources. This is the official document that the actual government gave to people who were going to decide your race. It is so important that we look at these primary sources. A person of mixed Indian and Negro blood should be returned as a Negro unless the Indian blood predominates and the status as an Indian is generally accepted in a community. Do you see what just happened? The government just gave enumerators permission to make a very subjective judgment about whether or not someone is generally accepted as an Indian in the community. You can kick and you can scream and you can be mad at me and you can call me whatever you want, but these are primary sources and here they are. Hi, my name is Danielle Romero. Thank you so much for being with me here on my channel where we talk about American identity and family stories. And before we jump back into the video, I would love to have you join me over at patreon.com/NYTN. We can chat, we can direct message, or you can send me a coffee at coffee.com/NYTN13. The government didn't just count race. In some ways, it invented it on paper. It created categories, defined them, changed them, and then this is the wild part, deleted entire categories without explaining what was going on, so you would get moved from here to here. The mulatto category existed for decades. My great-grandmother was considered mulatto when she was 10 years old, but then it went away. Gone. Poof. Millions of people who fit that classification suddenly had to figure out the new box to fit in, or they didn't fit anywhere at all. But it gets weirder. The government measured race in fractions. 1/8 black, that's an octoroon. 1/4, that's a quadroon. The US Census was literally like doing mathematical equations on people's bodies, trying to calculate how much of each race they were. Like race was a recipe and you could measure all the ingredients once the cake has been baked. But then, just 40 years after obsessing over these precise fractions, the government said, oh, well, actually, never mind. Actually, 1 drop of non-white blood and you're done. That's all it takes. We're not measuring anymore. We're just going to collapse you all into one category. So in the span of a single lifetime, America went from, we need to know exactly what fraction of black you are, to 1 drop's enough. This was not science. This was not objective. This is politics. It's a government trying to control and categorize people based on what the nation needed at that moment. We're going to get to that. And the obsession with racial categorization, it didn't come from Americans. It came from the government. So let's start at the beginning. 1790, George Washington is president. The Constitution is like literally drying. It's so brand new. And America takes its first census. Now, censuses aren't new. Governments have been counting people for thousands of years. But here is what was new. America decided to officially categorize people by race from the very first count in 1790. These racial categories were built into the American census system. You could argue that the United States government's relationship with race is as old as the American Republic itself. Because the census didn't just document race, right? It institutionalized race. It made race an official part of your identity. And it said, this is how we're going to recognize the people in our country by race. But here's where it gets weird. Early on, the government did not ask people what race they were. You didn't get to decide. An enumerator, this is the person that took the census, would walk around, knock on your door, and look at you and decide what race you were. So your race, your legal race, your legal racial standing with the United States government was determined by someone else's visual assessment. You can think about the problems that were built into that system. If I look at my comment section in the summer, sometimes even now, like in the winter, people literally are disagreeing with me about my race, disagreeing with each other about my race or my background. And you can see like you can't go by these visual cues. There are so many different parts that like my hair is naturally very curly and frizzy. And so that changes things, right? How you look, how you're perceived, if I'm wearing certain jewelry or if it's summer and I have a tan, like all of these things. So you can get the problems built into this system of just looking at someone, right? And it wasn't until 1960, nearly 200 years later, that the census said, okay, maybe people should decide their own race. Oh, okay. So let that sink in. For almost 2 centuries, the US government was literally assigning racial identity to millions of people without asking them what could go wrong. So let's talk about something that reveals the actual psychology of the American racial thinking. This is the treatment of multiracial people. So more than any other group, the United States kept changing how it counted people who were, we would say, both black and white. Now, if you're new on my channel, I don't subscribe to the crayon colors. I don't like it. I think one of my first rude awakenings was my now 6-year-old who was 5, and we were singing a song before bed, and we were singing like Jesus loves all the little children, all the children of the world. Red and yellow, black and white, they're precious in his sight. And he stopped me and he's like, Mommy, I don't know anybody that is those colors. And I was like, okay, you're like, what is this, right? What is this? But we use these terms black and white, and I'm going to use them because of the census data here is using them. So that's why I'm using them here. But this category kept changing, and the fact that this category was so revised so many times, I should say, tells you that America was constantly trying to solve a problem that didn't actually exist, except in the minds of people obsessed with this idea of racial purity. So let's go to 1850. The census instructed enumerators to count Black people, mulattoes, enslaved Black people, and enslaved multiracial people all separately. Do you see the distinction here? They didn't just want to count the different racial categories in 1850. They wanted to track and differentiate degrees of Blackness. That's important and intentional, and we're going to get to it. But it gets worse. In 1890, 40 years later, the categories became even more specific, and I would say, frankly, absurd. You could be classified as a quadroon, so it's 1/4 Black. Now, like, what is Black? I just need to do a sidetrack here. Again, for those of you who are new, I've taken a million DNA tests. I've put them all on here. They change nonstop. But I have definitely had tests show up where I have a quarter African ancestry. Now, some of it's North African, like Egypt, right, and Morocco. And I also have Nigerian, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes the tests are way less. It's like 7%. But we're saying Black. What does Black mean? Like, what does that mean, right? You're an octoroon, 1/8 Black, or any trace, any trace. The government was literally trying to measure and quantify Blackness in fractions. Why? Because race scientists, yes, that was a thing, and yes, I would say it was a pseudoscience, were theorizing that multiracial children were genetically inferior. And here's the kicker. They wanted census data to prove what they already believed. They wanted numbers. They wanted to use the government's official count to back up their view. Right, so they're not being informed by data. They want the data to support their views. The census wasn't just reflecting society's racial attitudes. It was being weaponized to create scientific-sounding justifications for those attitudes. So here's where it gets really strange. By 1930, just 40 years after the census was obsessively categorizing people into eighths and quarters and all that, everything changes again. And they're like, stop, throw it all out. The Census Bureau actually issued instructions that said anyone with any measurable amount of Black ancestry should be counted as Black. Okay, not some, not most, all of it. Any amount. So, again, these are things I've touched on before, but sitting in front of you right now, I would be censused as Black. Okay, I didn't grow up with that. I actually didn't grow up as white either. My dad just said, you guys are Italian, which is a whole nother set of videos that I've done, right? I didn't know about the other side of the family. And that changes, right? If you don't know about it and you don't look it, are you? I have a lot of questions, right? So I want you to read the actual language from the 1930 Census Enumerator Instructions. I think these are incredible primary sources. This is the official document that the actual government gave to people who were going to decide your race. It is so important that we look at these primary sources. You can kick and you can scream and you can be mad at me and you could call me whatever you want, but these are primary sources and here they are. A person of mixed white and Negro blood should be returned. That means I checked off as a Negro, no matter how small the percentage of Negro blood. Both Black and mulatto persons are to be returned as Negroes without distinction. What the heck? So these are all separate. They're all separate, right? There's no more measuring, though. There's no more calculating. If you had any Black ancestry, any at all, you are Black, period. That is the one-drop rule. Okay, so this is not new knowledge for most of you. But think about that shift for a second. So for decades, the government is obsessed with precision. They're out there with a freaking microscope. They got you under a microscope. They need to know, are you an 8th Black? Are you a 16th? They got all these, they're scribbling like this. They're making Blackness into mathematics, right? Suddenly, oh, never mind. Actually, just one drop. One drop's all it takes. Any trace, and now you're entirely absorbed into this other category. You aren't multiracial. You're not your own identity. You're just this other color. Okay, now here's what's important to understand. This was not more inclusive. This is not the government saying, hey, we recognize your full identity. No. This is the government saying, if you have any non-white ancestry, you cannot claim white status, period. We don't care about your other heritage, your other ancestors. You are only categorized by the non-white part. That's all that matters. So, if you have a basket of oranges and there's a couple of apples in there, this is actually just a basket of apples. That's what they're saying. So this rule holds for generations, decades, really. And I think it reveals something very fundamental about racial categories and how they were constructed. They were not scientific. They were political. This is about maintaining a racial hierarchy. This is about making sure anyone with non-white ancestry can't claim white privilege. And I know we hear that phrase and we go, no, and people get mad. Listen, I'm not a liberal. I'm not a Republican. I don't want any of that. But we have to be real about these sources. We have to be real about what this says. I am not making it up. You can look it up yourself. Why do you think that the categories change like this? Think about the time frame. Jim Crow, 1930s. They need to make a decisive move about who counts as white, who counts as Black. One-drop rule. Now, for people like me, I am mostly European. I have mostly Mediterranean heritage, but I have a lot of other things too. So this is what multiracial identity meant for most Americans in our history. Erasure. You are erased as a multi-ethnic or multiracial person. You are collapsed into one identity, whether you see yourself that way or not, whether you grew up that way or not. And the government looks at you and says, you are only the non-white part. That's what counts. That's how we count you. That's how we know you. But there's something I need to show you that actually makes this more disturbing. These were not abstract politics, right? These are literal instructions given to census workers. So I'm looking at the 1930 Census Bureau handbook right now, the actual document, section 151 on Negroes. I'll make sure it goes on the screen. So we had said a person of mixed white and Negro blood should be returned as Negro, no matter how small the percentage of Negro blood. Okay, but it goes further. It says, both Black and mulatto persons should be returned as Negroes without distinction. A person of mixed Indian and Negro blood should be returned as a Negro unless the Indian blood predominates and the status as an Indian is generally accepted in a community. This is the legal instruction manual. So unless the Indian blood predominates and the status of an Indian is generally accepted in a community. Do you see what just happened? The government just gave enumerators permission to make a very subjective judgment about whether or not someone is generally accepted as an Indian in the community. This is not science. I just cannot even believe this. This is social surveillance, okay, one. This is a census taker making assumptions based on local gossip and perception. Who are they going to talk to? If they talk to your neighbor who hates you, or they're hanging around the post office and asking, hey, what about old Joe over there? It's like, this is weirder. There's more. Can you believe it gets weirder? It does. Section 152 covers Indians. Quote, a person of mixed white and Indian blood should be returned as an Indian. except where the percentage of Indian blood is very small, or where he is regarded as a white person by those in the community where he lives. So indigenous people with white ancestry could be counted as white if local community thought of them as white. But if you were Black with Indian heritage, you were Black, period. No community consensus can save you. And then there's a note. It said, for Indians, columns 19 and 20 are thus to be used to indicate the degree of Indian blood in the tribe instead of the birthplace of the mother and father. So the government is literally asking census workers to estimate now the percentage of blood. I'm like, this is insane, right? Look at this language. The degree of Indian blood, like, is a liquid you can measure looking at someone. Like, it's dilutable. Like, it has degrees. This is what I want you to understand about our census categories and why, if you are not American, or maybe you are, why Americans are struggling with race today. These categories were forced upon us, and they were never objective. They were instruments of control. The government was using them to categorize people in ways that would let it seem official. You have local officials, community leaders determining who belongs where based on social standing, community acceptance, their appearance, your official racial identity, which impacted you greatly at the time, depended on what people thought of you, on gossip, on whether the community accepted you as white or Indian or something else. This is the real history of American census data. This is not neutral documentation. This is active surveillance. It's absolutely bizarre to me, okay? This is bizarre. It's bizarre. I'm going to shift for a second now because America's relationship with Asian categories is kind of a different story. It's one that's tied directly to immigration and, I would say, fear. So the first racial category that was specifically for Asians did not appear until 1870, and that's 80 years into our country's existence at this point. Why 1870? Well, that's when the Chinese immigration exploded. We had, thousands of Chinese workers coming to America to work on the Central Pacific Railroad. And suddenly the American government is very interested in counting them, right? Very interested in documenting them and controlling them. Chinese became an official census category because immigration is becoming a political issue. It's not about including them. It's about documenting them, controlling the narrative. But here's what's important. More groups arrive, right? We have Koreans, Filipinos, Asian Indians. The government didn't create categories for these people immediately. So in 1910, they introduced other as a category race for the first time. And you know who selected it? The vast majority of people who selected it were Korean, Filipino, etc. People who didn't have official boxes. So they were forced to be legally other. They didn't fit the system. They were like leftover categories. It wasn't until 2000, 80 years later, that those Americans could finally select either multiple races or write stuff in. So before that, you could be Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Hindu, or other Asian. Those are your options. That's a massive gap in how America counted Asian identity, if you're going to insist on counting it at all. So here's something that's going to sound subtle, but it's actually quite revolutionary, at least I think. In the 2020 census, the Bureau dropped the word Negro from the response option that had been Black, African American, or Negro. Now, that might sound like a tiny thing, but these words matter, especially here. Census languages matter a lot because it's official. This is what the government uses. It's what historians use. It's what gets written into the record. So Negro was a word that had been on census forms for a long time, right? It was a language of a certain era of America. And so by 2020, now it's gone. So the government looked at that word and said, we don't need this word anymore. That's not nothing. I think not everybody was happy about it. Okay, I'm not going to go into that now. You can let me know if that was how your family identified and, then it was dropped. I would love to hear about that. But this is the government, again, giving and taking away. And of course, the question is, what terminology do we need now? And this is where things get really interesting. So I'm going to take you back to 2000 again for a second. For the first time in American history, the census allowed people to select more than one race. I was 14 years old. So I want you to understand what that means. For over 200 years, if you were multiracial, the government said, no, choose one. Or we choose one for you, actually. And suddenly in 2000, they're like, okay, actually you can mark more than one. Why did it take over 200 years? Because people demanded it. By 2000, there are millions of people, like me, my kids, refuse to choose a box. I just refuse. And the government finally looked at census data and realized that we're not counting actual people. We're kind of just forcing them into categories that don't match how they see themselves and how they live their lives. For almost 200 years before that moment, multiracial people have existed, multi-ethnic people. They were always there. Parents have multiracial children, communities have multiracial families, but America did not have an official way to count them or did not want to. I would say maybe America chose not to, because acknowledging that multiracial identity threatened the entire logic of racial categories in the first place, right? Which raises the question, what else aren't we counting? Or whether their categories or identity or experience are missing because there hasn't been space made for them. Let's talk about the Hispanic Latino categories. I did a video on this a long time ago, but just to touch on it, this does get genuinely confusing, and I think it's intentional in a weird way. So in 1930, the census had a racial category called Mexican, and I've had ancestors be checked off as Mexican on there just that 1 year. Then for 50 years, there's no Hispanic category of any kind. You couldn't identify as Hispanic. If you were Mexican American or Puerto Rican or Cuban or anything else Hispanic, they didn't have a box for you. So it wasn't until 1980 that the census asked about Hispanic origin as a separate question from race. Like, this still confuses me, okay? It's a separate question. It's not a race, it's an ethnicity, they're saying, which means you could be Hispanic of any race. You could be Black and Hispanic, white and Hispanic, whatever. But this is where it gets weird. I think for 40 years, the Census Bureau has been testing whether or not they should merge the race and ethnicity questions into one. So they've been experimenting since 2010 with a combined question that would let Hispanics select Hispanic as their race or their ethnicity, their race. So the Office of Management and Budget in 2020 said no, they don't approve that change. But the kicker is that in 2030, the census does plan to introduce a combined race and ethnicity category for the first time. So we're finally going to make it official that your racial identity and your ethnic identity do not have to be separate. You could be Hispanic as a race. You don't have to pick white or Black or something else. Okay, so this is bureaucratic for sure. And this is a conversation that we have in our home. My husband, he has Hispanic ancestry. I do too, but I have not been connected to it like he does. And so when he brings our kids places, he's checking off that form. And I have always felt kind of weird about it because honestly, I would rather not do any checking off at all. But in 2030, things are changing. Things are being combined. So let's round it out here, the native question. American Indians were not even identified as a racial category until 1860. So for 70 years on the census, Native Americans had no official box. Now, there were special censuses, that sounds weird, censuses done in Indian country. And my third great grandma and her family were censused as Choctaw in Indian country. That's a special census, but that's not the overarching government census. So they were just counted as something else or maybe not counted at all. In 1890, the census started doing a complete count of American Indians on tribal land and on reservations, which is the one I'm talking about. So suddenly now the government cares very much about knowing exactly how many Native people are here on reservations and tribal land, like very specific, right? Then in 1960, there was categories for Eskimo, I believe, but only in Alaska. I think it was Inuit and Eskimo. So you had to be in Alaska to officially check those off. If you were somewhere else, you weren't allowed to have That's like, if you move from Alaska to like Washington, you're no longer, right? In 2000, then these categories were grouped together as American Indian or Alaska Native, and then you could write in your tribe. So the progression, again, you see it. It tracks directly with government policy towards Native Americans, right? You can see it. As the federal policy changes, their watching of who these people are and where they are changes as well. So, okay, let's zoom out for a second, because what we're really talking about here is the philosophy behind America and how she counts herself. Every single census category I have mentioned reflects the politics and science of the time. These categories aren't objective, right? We can agree on that. These are deliberate choices about what the government wants to measure and how and when, right? Why would the government care about measuring the difference between quadroons and octoroons? Well, because at that time, that mattered. Why would the government suddenly care about the Chinese in 1870? Well, because the immigration was a political issue. These aren't like accidents, bureaucratic accidents. These are choices that reveal what the government thought was important to count, what they were trying to control. And this is what really gets me. For most of American history, people didn't get to make these choices for themselves. It wasn't until 1960 that someone could say, actually, this is how I identify. This is how I see myself. The fundamental question, though, for me is the same. Why does the government need to categorize people by race at all? Now, I understand demographics matter, understanding population distribution, health outcomes, economic statuses. I get that. They're looking for patterns. But the history of this data is the history I feel like of using to justify something else. So when we talk about census categories, we're not just talking about needing data, right? We're talking about official language of American power, right? This is built into the system. It's baked in. So here's what I want you to take away from this. The census is not objective. We use it to research our family. Amazing, valuable tool. But it has never been objective. It's a political document dressed as demographic language, and every revision is reflecting a shift in American politics. And if you're descended from people who were told they weren't allowed to claim their full identity, they didn't even know what it was, honestly, who doesn't have some of that? This history matters. It matters. It explains why some identities have been erased and different things, but it also explains why we're still having these conversations. Maybe we don't want to play ball at all. And so we'll see what happens with the 2030 census. Let me know what you think. And if you'd like to watch any other videos about DNA tests and census records, I'll leave those here. Otherwise, we'll talk soon.